3 workshops before, yesterday and this morning. And the idea is that we now, after a lecture in the morning, are talking about naturalistic planting with a starting point in a specific project. We have a kind of program where we run through, and basically there will be a presentation from Upland Landscape, who is the partner who has brought in the project, and then Nigel Dunnett and Marie will try to maybe put up some headlines within the specific subjects where we can also announce which kind of discussions do we think is important. I also learned that Peter will also announce some questions that we can discuss, so hopefully we'll have a lot. And then we will start the discussion about the project. And under this process, it might also be that some of you would like to say something, ask something, and that's okay. You just mark with the finger, and then we try to incorporate this also in the settings. And when we think, experience that the energy and the discussions is maybe about to end, then we try to wrap it all up just by having a brief summing up what we have been discussed, and then we'll also ask Upland Landscape to summarize what they are bringing back home, so we have kind of conclusion on this workshop. So that's basically the setting. The last 3 workshops is announced, or all 4 have been announced to be a little more than 2 hours, but we have learned over the days that it can be difficult actually to talk so long time about the subject, so we'll just cut off when it's needed, and at a maximum we will be finished at 3:15. So that's basically the thing. Maybe I should also mention that my name is Torben Dam. I'm an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, and my part in this is that within research and teaching, I think it's very, very important that we also are going into the actual work of landscape design and are discussing projects rather than just products or overarching subjects. And another thing in this is that we, and especially Marie, has also made 2 years ago down here and a planting demonstration of different kinds of shrubs and entries to that discussion, and that's why we also want to bring that into the discussion also. So much for the introduction. I think we should start, and I will hand over the word for Peter first. So.
Okay, please. Thank you, Torben. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I hope you will have a nice day here and have a great discussion. I hope you'll ask questions if there's something you would like to know more about or that is unclear, because my English is not that good. So we would like to present a project, ongoing project, a project we have been working with in 13 years now. So the interesting about this is it is in Ørestad, Groningen, in Copenhagen. It's a large-scale urban space, you can say, with a large building, large green areas, mostly grass areas for the beginning, and very windy, artificial islands. So it's surplus soil. It's not a good way to start plantings normally. So what do? We have a task here. I can go further here, just a minute. Just stay short about the program. I will just talk about the background, the natural resources, and some phases we have done of this project in 2008, 2010, and 2016. And afterwards I have some questions I'll ask, so maybe can start a debate. And we also have a lot of plans we can discuss. So, Ørsted, I think most of you know the place. I don't know if you know it, Nigel. But it's a place with large-scale buildings, as you can see, surroundings, very windy conditions, not very human scale, not for a start at least. The town, the development, By and Havn, handed over this to the residents with a small planting from the beginning, made from the landscape architect company Ting and Reinø, who are also here today. They also already did some of the plantings. They did the Quercus robur, the Fraxinus excelsia, and Lus glutinosa. That was the 3 species planted as trees in some areas of the big site here. So they had done some soil improvements, but it's still a very bad condition, bad soil to plant in. Here you can see the grass can't even grow. It's very silty soil. It's subsoil more than mulch, so it's very difficult to get something to grow there. Either it's very dry or it's very wet. So this overall plan here, it was the inhabitants, residents asked us to make a plan. How can we make this better? How can we make this human? How can we make it interesting for the animals? How can we make some shadow, some shelter? We'd like to have some insects, some birds nesting and feeding. We'd like some, more like a natural, more a better area to stay in. So this is just the way we did it. There are actually this is Amagerfællet, which is natural, self-grown plants. So we're going into the more urban spaces or city. The main idea was actually to make it more urban in the northern part and in the middle part. Also urban, but more like a park. And further down to the natural area, more natural plantings. So that was the main idea. The problem was that we didn't have a lot of money. It was a small budget compared to the large area. So we couldn't just make the same start with the soil improvements overall. We couldn't do that. So we had the idea of making larger spaces where we already had the trees growing. It was the first plan to make the scale better, to make it relate to the tall buildings. Be sure to have some tall trees to be there. But there was no shrubs at the beginning. So of course we'd like to add some shrubs to have some shelter, to have some insects and wildlife. And then in the bottom, in the ground, we couldn't just plant a lot of perennials. So we did the seeding with natural, different natural herbs. It's a little slow, just a minute. Okay, this is just the principle I can explain here. As you can see, we have some of the existing trees. We planted in some other trees and the shrubs, and also to have some evergreen. We planted the Pinus mugo because we thought that would be the spine in the planting system. So we had something in the winter time. Also, we would like to add some spaces inside these. Do you call it? Clumps of plantings. Here it's a playground, and we'll also like to have something to eat for humans as well as for the animals. So the beginning here, you can see we one example here. We actually planted far from each other. We planted shrubs. I think it's Gustrum ovalifolium here, and then we did the seeding out in the autumn. Here you can see what it looks like. A lot of water, very bad conditions. And 1 year after, I think some of the places, some of the pictures are 1 year after. We can see the shrubs coming up, and the perennials are starting to grow now. These are the seedings, or most of them are the one we seeded out. Also some annuals to have to be sure that some flowers would come the first year, because it takes 2 to 3 years to have the perennials flowering. That's also always a good thing to start with the cornflower and the papaver. So yeah, we have some in the beginning. Also some smaller, less aggressive grasses are good to cover the soil. So the idea was actually also to make an environment to the shrubs, to the trees, the microclimate, make sure that there could be some moist, make sure we have some with the taproot that would break the soil and make it be transparent for water, and start to make a bed that actually is good for having plants and larger plants as well. It's winter time, you can see. That's why I would like to add some Pinus mugo, or at least something that is evergreen. And then in 2016, you can see actually some of the ideas are coming through now. We have the space, we have the potential to play inside here under the big trees from the beginning. Actually, the Fraxinus is very good out there. And we have a lot of the seeding that is coming, not all of it, but a lot is actually coming part-time. We also did some very different kind of expressions here with the gray theme, with salix, which is very, very good. This is planted in 2007, I think. So it's 12 years old, those salix. It really works. And also we did some specific sites. We did the soil improvements and planted the perennials, but also some of the species that were shoot out. Here, Echium vulgare, slangehoved, is coming, and it's also making something to the plantings actually. And it's not what it was supposed to be actually from the beginning, but why not? It's a flower, it's nice, it's coming there, so it's allowed to be there.
Yeah. That's the same way I'm thinking.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot of plant lists we can go through if you'd like to see them afterwards, but I'll just tell you just briefly about we couldn't get the grass to grow, so we made this this bed where we could gather the water and use it for other plant types. So we tried that in 2016, and also here we have something that works and something that doesn't work at all. You can see where we would like to plant in the perennial. It's very difficult with the bad soil we have there. So the best actually we can do, this is in the center of the basin here, and when we sew out, when we're sewing out the perennials, it's much better. It's coming much better. Not all of the species, but it's much easier because it's allowed to be there. That's our experience, at least. Yeah. Afterwards, we have done some other butterfly and bee friendly sewing here, and it's really working. It's 2 years. It is 2 years old. This hill, small hill. So there are a lot of bees and butterflies there now. But now you haven't seen all the plant lists and so on. I can go further into it, but I have some questions, or we would like to ask you if you have experienced or would like to ask something about should we have done something different about the plant density, maybe the species. Should we have been choosing another kind of species? What about the plant size? And then what about the management of the ground? Could we do something different that would make have a faster effect, maybe a more expressive effect for also the human beings? They would like to see some flowers and insects and so on. So that's a short, yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Now I think we come forward, and Nigel and Marie, you might have some starting points where you think now Peter have asked questions.
Sure.
Do we have some headlines for discussion?
Torben has asked to start with some headlines without getting into any detail. Of course, the interesting thing comes into the detail. But in addition to your questions, coming from what you said, I think the question is, how can we make positive use of the negative things of the site and the constraints? So when we use words like poor soil and bad conditions and windy, they have the negativity with them. Are there ways that we can explore these constraints to say, well, actually these could be positive things that allow us to do something different? Because sometimes using the words bad and negative are associated with maybe the way we normally do things, and we can't do them. So maybe that's a thought. And I think as well something you mentioned kind of in passing about the concept of going from sort of natural on the edge of the site coming into more urban. I'm not sure what you meant by more urban, but I think it's a question really about this thinking that we have to have these gradients of naturalness, going from maybe a rural, more maybe left alone edge into an urban centre. And can the natural feel and the wild feel actually be something that works really well in the urban? So again, can we think differently about these? And I guess a question back from me to you is that some of the images of the flowering meadows were obviously, I guess, May, June, and I wonder how does this plant selections plant list look in now, August, September, October, when the weather is still good and people are out there, and it's not like time to stay inside and we don't really mind what the landscape is.
Interesting. And you stayed up there.
I'll see if I can do the same. One thing that I think is very interesting is that you say we'd like to make it a better place, and I think that's worth talking about. What is a better place in this exact place? So that's the one headline. And then what was it? I just missed it.
We'll come back.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that the scale. How can we work with the scale? How have you worked with the scale? Because you have something that's very vast, big building blocks, and how have you managed to kind of grab the area with the with your design?
Okay, thank you. Now we have some kind of thing. You have asked questions, you have comments, and so on. So now we have to somehow to pick on something that we'll start with. Maybe it would this discussion that you rose, Nigel, about the degree of naturalness. Maybe we could start because we have learned also in the other projects that we've been discussing that this kind of vision, what is it actually we can have as a vision, which can be a very important guideline to guide ourselves, but also our clients and the public in general. So maybe there's something there we could discuss a little further. Could you take it a little further?
I guess. I don't know if you were here this morning when I gave a talk early on about the project I've done at the Barbican in London, which is very, very similar in a way, very urban, big open spaces. And we proposed something very natural, but kind of strongly designed. And I had a concern then, is this too natural? Just, also because it was a modernist architecture design, and the original landscape was modernist, which means minimalist, which means very little landscape in terms of green, and big open plazas and so on. And so we proposed to bring a lot of green and nature in. But actually what our discussions with residents and people using the site say, they actually love the really natural and wild character. And the contrast is so strong that the very urban context makes the naturalness more desirable, but the wildness increases the strength of the architecture. And so to always go with something which is formal and modernist in amongst modern architecture and modern urban development isn't necessarily the right way to go. It could almost be the opposite way. But I think the gradient has to be in terms of strength of design, and do you work more with colours and you go from native to non-native or mixed. So I think there still needs to be the gradient, but maybe it's within a character framework that doesn't change.
Would you add something to this discussion? No. Okay.
But maybe we could just answer that. That was also I wasn't part of the first part of the project, but I did some of the second part in 2016, and we had a large process in the beginning with the residents, and this was also what came forth there. No one asked for more. Maybe it's also part of the time right now. It's maybe different in 2007, but no one asked for more hedges or more, stemmed trees. Everybody wants more flowers, wants more fruit, wants more wildlife, wants more. So this is, I think, it's a lot to do with the time as well. But in general, is it what the architect wants or what the residents want? Maybe that you let shine through.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think then in terms of the planting, the discussion starts to come in terms of the content and work within the natural area, and this is where we start to get into difficulties when we are dealing with the ecological or naturalistic landscapes. And I don't know if you've had a policy level or kind of a guidance or principle to work mostly with native plants, but I think from the kind of meadow grassland, it's native wildflowers, which is great, but the problem is they finish flowering probably like 6 weeks ago, a month ago. So in these very visible places which are kind of hostile to people to begin with, you have a kind of a hostile looking landscape, and the way I kind of overcome that with making meadows is to use the idea of pictorial meadows. So they are kind of meadows, but they're not nature meadows. They're design meadows for the visual effects. And let's say with annuals, they have a lot of native things in them which carry on maybe sort of May, June, July. But then we have North American prairie type annuals which do not start flowering until July, and they carry on, and maybe this is the big time for them. And so these meadows look really beautiful now, but they've also looked really beautiful in June and July, and then we have nice seed heads and structures and so on. But then that gives you a discussion with ecologists and with other people saying, well, this is really bad to be doing. It's almost like a crime to be kind of doing this, which makes it really difficult. But I see no logical reason for why this should be a crime in a site or place like this.
So, what is the difference between a garden where you can plant every species, also from abroad, and a larger park close to the edge?
Well, you could argue that when you have a place that is kind of protected or has a special flora and fauna, then perhaps you should walk more gentle. But the problem is, this is a very, very important discussion, and it's actually very important, in my opinion, that we also take it together with the biologists so that we actually begin to communicate. But that's a long story.
But yesterday you also had a point about biodiversity and the layer structures, and that may be also something that you could repeat now, because I think that's also going into the discussion of biodiversity.
Yeah.
Can you take it a little further?
Well, there's a lot of research about use of structural, more complex structures in the plantings. And one of the things that we can see is that the more complexity you see, the more layers you find in the plantings, the more you actually support the biodiversity. And some even say that it's more important with the different layers than it is with the actual big different species if you are designing something. Because when you get the different layers, you get the different places for animals where they can sleep and where they can hibernate and where fungi can grow and blah blah blah. There's a lot of things that goes together, and the more difference there is in all the layering, the more different habitats you are actually providing.
I agree. At Sheffield we've done some of this research and more. And we did a big study called Biodiversity in Urban Gardens, which I think is the biggest one that's been done, and looked at all the different types of gardens, highly maintained, non-maintained, native plants only, no native plants, and kind of found out what was the best to support the greatest biodiversity of invertebrates. And exactly as you say, it's the structure, the layers, but also the diversity of plants. And the fact of whether they were native or not native had no significant effect. And these are uncomfortable things for ecologists to hear, because, and I'm an ecologist, so I can say it, but there's all the thinking that we must use native plants, or there's these associations, close associations with individual insects and individual plants. And that is true for some specialist things. But the reality is it's the structure and the diversity that's important. For invertebrates, having some areas like of open, stony, sandy soil in amongst the plants is also really good. It's the structure of the landscape. So you can make really strong cases for the biodiversity, the wildlife benefit, without having to play by the rules that we kind of are told we have to play by.
And I think that actually brings us back to what you said as your number 2 thing about the things we find difficult about a site, and how we can actually take that into an advantage. And I think...
What can we call a bad soil or poor growing conditions? how can we turn that positive?
Well, I guess it depends on your reference point. So if your reference point is horticulture, traditional horticulture, then your objective is to grow the biggest and the best plants and have a successful establishment and maybe the greatest biomass and best flowers and best fruit. If you're an ecologist, maybe your aim is total diversity of planting, structural diversity, and you're not too concerned about the quality of the individual plant. Perhaps it's the mix. But also, I think again we're in this mindset of traditional horticulture where we celebrate bigness and the individual plant, and the conditions we need to create these fantastic show plants are the opposite ones that we need to create ecological richness. So we kind of don't want rich, fertile soil, we don't want lots of water. So in some ways you're starting from a better point because you can, but there are soil problems, like from just what you say, it's very silty, very fine, so there's no structure. But you are starting from a benefit of lower productivity. And some of the issues where you say, well, the grasses don't grow very fast, well, potentially that's great. Because one of the big problems with trying to make wildflower meadows with grasses in the mix is the grasses just become dominant and you don't get the flowers. So you kind of have a starting point there. But the fact that when it dries out, maybe it becomes solid, and when it becomes wet, it just becomes...
It's like either completely hard and cracked or completely...
So we are starting to say we have interesting soil conditions. Prosperous soil conditions.
But I mean, when I moved into our house together with my husband, and he's a very entrepreneurial guy, and he's doing things very quickly, and we had driveway into our home, and he just woof, and it was totally plastered over with solid gravel and 50 centimeters. And I was just, oh, my clematis, and I saw all these things in that area. But I soon realized that some weeds could grow there. And then I started picking weeds and tried them. And now I have this road planting with very non-aggressive weeds growing there, flowering. So.
I was thinking now I'm making a little fun out of this about the bad soil conditions, but could we narrow it in with some kind of plants? Which kind of things are solid starters in this kind of situation?
Well, I think it is difficult with this situation where there's very little soil structure. So I would go a little bit further back from that and ask the question, when we're talking about planting design in these situations, should as much effort and consideration be put into the soils and the substrates and getting those sorted out, as well as the plant list and the planting design? Because investment in that saves so much time later on and gives you quicker results. But it's an additional cost at the start of the project. And I think we have the problem that the budgets for making things are different to the budgets for looking after things. If it was all connected, then you'd put more money up front and save money later on. And I guess it doesn't work like that in maybe this case. But you still maybe have to do remediation work and go back in again and replant. And possibly you save that.
Guy having a broken car.
So one of the things that we do, and maybe some of you have experience of this as well, on difficult sites or sites which are really weedy, is that we might put another layer on top of gravel or sand and then plant into that something with a bit more structure, but not needing to completely change the soil or completely cultivate. Maybe you loosen it, decompact, but you put a layer on top which allows the plants to establish and then go down into the soil. And the important thing about that is it's still low fertility, so that you are not increasing that productivity, but you're giving your plants a head start. and you kind of eliminate weed competition early on, and the roots are able to get into something more porous than something which is just a complete solid with no air or water space in it. And so this is a kind of say it's almost like an organic or non-chemical way of removing weed problems, but also having some sort of structure and starting point. And then, if that's maybe an additional expense, to use low-cost establishment techniques to do more seeding, or combine planting and seeding rather than everything being planted, or plant smaller woody plants because they'll catch up later on.
And that's a good point, because as I can see in my research and in my shrub plantings over there, that a lot of shrubs, they can actually come up very well, even though they are in the middle of a lot of competition from weed. It just takes a bit longer. So it's like an investment you can make for very little money.
And I'd also say part of it is exactly what you said, is about the need to have some sort of quick effect. Because maybe if it's in somebody's private garden, you're working with a client, it's okay to take 2 or 3 years before things start to happen. But from my imagining and from similar sites in the UK, that if you have a site that's not looking good and it's maybe failing to establish or it's very slow, then that can encourage a lot of other activity on the site, or lack of care or lack of respect. And so having kind of quick win, quick colourful burst. I saw you had Phycelia and kind of seeded.
Yes,
Seeded, I mean, you can do big scale
And no
kind
cost.
of art installations in a way on these sorts of sites. As the first year, really bring people along with you, a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, and gradually it turns over to the final point. So these kind of colourful, exciting things, they could fill the whole site for a year or 2 years, and I don't know, maybe you have them here, but I've been involved in several projects with artists in the UK to do just that, where you might sort of have wheat, cornfields, or different colour patterns just for the first year in these big social sites. And then gradually the woody plants, the perennials take over.
Yeah. You also now, in your headlines, mentioned this question of the season of plants, and in this book you and also this morning you're pointing out this note that you have the power of 3, and maybe we could take that as a kind of starting point for some of the discussions about the species, and maybe also this about the lush flowering over the whole season.
Yeah. So again, I don't know if you were when I gave the talk this morning, but with the more naturalistic plantings, I like to keep the visual effect simple at any one time, kind of what's here in a way. So instead of having 50 different plants kind of singing and shouting at you in different colours and different shapes, you have maybe 2 or 3 at one time, but then 2 or 3 weeks later another 2 or 3 have come up, and so between May and October you have these different waves of colour and effect. The challenge, again, what we said before, is what to do from July until now. If you're trying to work with the native wildflowers. But there are really nice native species which will flower now, but you don't often see them in these sorts of seed mixes. And we mentioned yesterday Linaria vulgaris, which is kind of flowering now, yellow. You do not see it so much in these kind of meadows, but that's something that really doesn't start flowering until the end of the summer, and it can change big areas just a beautiful primrose yellow. And other things as well. There's also by playing around, when you've got big spaces, by playing around with the maintenance with meadows, that I guess you know this, that if you maybe cut them earlier in the year, say cut them short until May, and then stop cutting, everything flowers later. And then you might have other areas which flower earlier. So you can just through management have a patchwork of colour and interest from the same meadow mix across the site. And I'm just saying that because of the huge areas that you have potential to play with here. They can be big scale effects. Yeah, I think as well, we said this a bit this morning as well, with the meadows, if that's what we're kind of focusing on at the moment. A lot of the way we think about and we kind of learn about making meadows comes from making meadows for nature conservation or for ecology, where you have the species list, which is very similar to plant communities you would find growing in nature in the rural situations. And all of our understanding about what to do with those comes from that. Even through the idea, and I'm speaking about the UK, that we cut the meadows in July, August, and we take everything away. And we do that because that's what farmers did, and therefore that's what we have to do. But in a garden or a design landscape, why do we need to do that? Why do we need to cut the meadows now, or a little bit earlier, when things are still flowering? And even if they're not still flowering, you have all the structures for the beetles and the spiders and everything, and then you cut it all away. And there's still maybe 2 or 3 months of growing nice time. So when we have in design settings, we can do many different things with meadows. We can, of course, have no grasses, just flower-rich meadows, or only really clump-forming grasses. We can have different colour-themed meadows. We can change the plant selection to only having the best flowering things. Myself and my colleague James Hitchmo, we did the Olympic Park in London, which was mostly meadows, but designed meadows, and with native wildflowers, but none of our meadow mixes had any kind of relationship to anything you would find in the countryside, because we were taking the best flowering things, maybe from different types of habitats, and putting them together, and so you had this explosion of flower colour from native plants, but not in a way that you'd recognise from the countryside. And we don't cut our meadows until October, and the research that we've done suggests that actually the flowering plants in meadows which are cut later, they flower more because they're not cut back halfway through their growing time. But you also encourage the more aggressive grasses because you're not cutting those back. So there's all the trade-off. But I think what I'm saying is that just because things have always been done one way doesn't mean we have to continue doing them that way, and we can be really creative with a lot of these naturalistic ideas, even if they're just restricted to native plant habitats.
I would like to ask, if you have any comments or if you have any questions, you're welcome to join in.
One thing I saw, just moving on from the meadows, thinking more about the plantations, there was one photo that you had which had like a rose.
Yes. The roses love it out there.
Yeah. There.
That one.
Yeah.
And I think this is, for me, this is something which has huge potential as well. And to mix shrubs, the wild shrubs like the roses, the species roses, the wild roses, into meadows and into plantations. And we have the word scrub, and I don't know what your equivalent for kind of shrubland. But they're usually quite negative, depressing things, because again, they're bad for animals, and they're not very productive, so they have bad names like Badlands or Scrub. And but as a vision, I think it's a really nice one of sort of wild, usually rose family plants, on dry places mixed with small trees like Sorbus or Crataegus. But then with diverse grassland in amongst them. And to me, actually, that may be the best model for urban landscapes, not meadows by themselves, not woodland by themselves, but this halfway between woodlands and meadows, and this sort of thing which sits between them. And I just saw that there. I don't know what rose that is. I don't know if it's a cultivated garden rose, but
It's Maiden's Blush.
yeah. But the Rosa canina and Rosa arvensis and the native species roses, and then thinking about maybe other species roses from other places that have this feel, but they also have the fruits later on. That starts to add a different element to the shrub in plantations. I think, as with Marie's work, there's so much more exciting things to be done by adding low maintenance but high performing shrubs into these landscapes.
We had this presentation, and Peter told us that there was a 27 edition, and then there was a 2011 edition of the plantings. This situation where there is something, and the fraxinus trees were quite tall already, and so on. Does that provide some new potentials in also bringing up some of the ground level plantings? Or do you see it as actually you could start from day one and without trees, or where's the difference there? I was looking at you, but I'm more sharing than actually coming up with solutions, so you have to be there. But basically, I think there's a discussion between whether it should be just meadows, and you are bringing in now the other plantations, but the situation out there where they have already trees that are established, could that make a new potential or new possibility for the thing?
Yeah, I think the thing about these huge areas of open space around housing and so on is the lack of human scale, isn't it? Like it's exactly what you said. And it's difficult to say it, but sometimes there's just too much green space. If it's not productive or it's not positive, it can have the wrong effects. And it would seem to me to be a priority that the woodland, the plantations are set up as quickly as possible, and to work with those existing ones, maybe as islands, these kind of centres which you can start to build out from, but somehow to get three-dimensional structure into these big open expanses would be important. And we focused a lot this morning on woodland and forest planting, but it's kind of, I think, what we should maybe be thinking more about in the future. Partly because forest is the natural state and open grassland is unnatural here, so we're fighting against nature, especially when you have so much of it that you don't necessarily need all of this grass everywhere. But also with climate change and the sort of heat that we've been having late on in the year, and like last year, we need more shade and more cooling, and that's what the trees do. So that then gives us another reference point, and for a lot of naturalistic planting design, the reference points have been open, sunny grasslands or prairies or steppe. And we've derived all the principles from studying these. We should now move on to woodland edges and to forests and to study these in the same way, and develop sets of rules and principles for planting design, naturalistic planting design, that take all the perennial planting ideas from grasslands but apply them to woodland. So I think it's a huge potential to work with that, especially if you have existing trees, then you don't have to wait for the shade to come.
But then we have to move into, as you say, different kind of images where we leave this open grassland. There's a finger there, Marie.
Probably paraphrasing you now, but I can't help but thinking maybe we could have gone faster by going slower and actually looked at succession and actually started there, because it would have been easier to get the trees to grow and develop if you'd started the microclimate sort of
Sure.
Moving on faster by starting with the small ones.
This is exactly what I've been thinking, and I think you're both very brave to stand up here with everybody telling you what should have been done.
No, we would like to know.
I think that
we are humble about the plans. We know.
Very trial and error.
But I think now this is probably what we would say, and I think with these big areas, then you probably could leave parts of it just alone, just to develop by itself, and it takes time. But I think when you have the space, you can start to zone out a site and be more intensive in maybe where it's closer to where people are. But then you can leave out other areas just to completely do their own thing. And then other places, well, maybe, yes, you do set up new woodland plantations, but by using just small trees and shrubs, and they take longer. But what I would say about that is that, again, I think my big message from today is that we don't always have to do things in the future the way things have been done in the past. And we very often just do things like that because that's what other people have done, and we've always done it like that, without thinking. And in making new woodland plantations with young trees, certainly the practice has been that you must keep bare soil or clean conditions around young trees, because anything underneath them will compete too much with the trees. This is thinking like a forestry person, where you want to maximise the growth and productivity of the trees. And in this situation, we're not making a productive woodland for timber. And also, a lot of the competition comes from grasses around the trees. So I think there's really exciting possibilities to close plant young trees, a metre tall, and then seed annual mixes or flower-rich perennial mixes underneath these trees, which for the first 3-4 years will look beautiful, and then as the trees grow up and the shade comes, they'll gradually disappear, but then you have the trees. And it's just a different way of thinking about how to establish, and I think sites like this do offer that potential.
One thing I have to say is that I find it very, very interesting the way you've actually worked with it, and you've tried different things, and you have tried something in the big scale, and then you have chosen some smaller areas where you have done some change of substrate, and you really worked over this area with many different approaches, yes, and that's also why you bring it here.
Yes.
It's because it's something that has become a part of you, and I think this is the kind of enthusiasm that is needed to get these plantings that we have.
I would just say back to some of your questions about plant density and seeding and so on. I don't know if you can see these ones, but they're very beautiful. The kind of young meadows and plantations in here.
The dead things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They took a long time to get started on this soil. Yeah.
I like to sometimes do a mixture of planting and seeding. So let's say it's the meadowy or perennial type planting. Or maybe you plant a framework of really robust architectural perennials that you know will look good in year one. You don't have to wait 3 years before they really start to flower. But that can be at low density, maybe 1 every 5 square meters or less. So it's really low cost. And then you seed around those. So you don't have this problem of big areas looking bad in the first year or two. You've got something coming up. So in this sort of situation, maybe big verbascums. You know, if you planted the big verbascums one every three square meters and one every 5 square meters, you know, each plant would get as tall as here and spread out a meter. So you don't need many of them, and then you seed in between those. You would have this amazing, for year 1 or year 2, at very low cost, as an alternative to something which doesn't look like anything for the first year or 2.
There was a marking there from Ivan.
Yeah, do you work with a specific definition on what kind of habitat you want to end with, or does that just happen on the way? And how do you introduce that for the public? Because the way that people, kids and so on, take that under their skin is very important for the future.
Yeah. So I don't think that's a question. I think that's a statement of what we have to do.
If you work with
yeah, absolutely. And this is why developing a typology or a kind of classification of the end habitats or vegetation types is so important. So you have this long-term vision, and that's also why the design is only part of it. Of course, it's the maintenance, the management is also equally important from the start. But I think you're completely right that we get so caught up with the technical side of how do we make things grow and how do we make things successful. You kind of forget what is that vision of what we're aiming for in the end. And it might take 20 years or more to get there. The question is, do people living around and using this have 20 years to wait before you get to that final stage, or do you need to think about a series of stages to get there? Or do you zone the site? The way I would do it, I think, is to zone the site more intensively around where people are using it or where people are living, and you have that quick effect, and then you can start to do the more habitat biotope that is further away.
Is it? Good. I think that one upcoming question that's been both days is also the maintenance and the cost. So I think that might also be kind of way in to discuss this project. And you, Nigel, also mentioned that putting together the plants in a kind of ecological setting or idea is actually also one of the ways actually to control the cost and actually make it cheaper maintenance. So can you say something more about that in this kind of respect?
Well, I guess it's kind of easy to say these things, and it's more difficult when you have a site. But of course, there are many things to do at the design stage to reduce the cost of the maintenance. And that's why the ecological approach is so important, that you are matching the plant communities to the site conditions, or maybe to the conditions that you create, but you're not putting a huge amount of energy into making completely different conditions to suit the plants that you want to grow. And so this is where we come back to the soil and the conditions you have, and if you were starting now, are there sort of natural counterparts to this silty, difficult soil? Maybe it would be on the alluvial, the edge of rivers, or I don't know, coastal or very dry places that get some flooding. I don't know. But it's partly from a real understanding of the ecological conditions on site at the outset, and then matching the plant communities to that. But I would just say I don't think in this situation I don't need to get caught up with the arguments about native, non-native. I think that's a philosophical thing, and you could easily make a credible site just by making reference to native habitats. Or you could do something equally amazing by matching plants for the right conditions. That's a design decision. But I think that ecological approach does have the benefit of reducing the energy input needed to maintain a landscape the way you want it, not the way the site wants it.
But how is it? I would say that if you would have to keep the structural biodiversity, you'll have to do the maintenance after that idea, that keep the structure with all the layers. So
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be forest, as you say.
Yeah.
So and other also the seeding and the wildflower often have to be cut in May, as you said, because the grass are so high. You need to get some light down. So maybe it's twice a year you have to do it to get the best out of the flowering of the wild seeds.
Yeah.
And you have to be in the spot to look and see, do we have to do it twice this year or do we not? So you have to be very specific to be on the sites, to be there. And that's the most, I think, interesting part of our profession, because so many just plant and they plant big and it's finished the way when they move away, and then they don't see it anymore. Here we have followed it many years, and we can see what works, and we can use the plants next time to plant in, and it's really I think we often forget the time. It's so important. You have to also tell people that it takes time, and you have to develop it by time. It will change in every ways.
So is this continuous involvement, is that normal for you, or is this kind of a special
for me,
case?
For us, yes.
For you
Yes.
as a practice,
But
to be able to have this ongoing.
Yeah. Because we have made this maintenance plan, management plan in 2008 and 12 and 16, and now again in 2020. So we'll make the plan again and take a look at the
opportunity to adjust to what works and what doesn't.
So I think this is touching on maybe the biggest issue to do with all of this, and you kind of have the best solution, which unfortunately doesn't happen in most cases. But this is a model for how it should be.
I was just thinking about this to make sure you have the structures. I think we shouldn't make it too complicated, because it's also about if you are making a design that means that you will have different structures, then it's about going along and saying, well, now there's too much forest, for example, that start again and say, now we make some more meadows. To make some, it doesn't have to be an every year or twice a year thing. It's more like a principle, and the problem, as I see it, is that we tend to think about plantations as if we can only do shrub plantings or perennial plantings or tree plantings, whereas there's so much more to actually get out of using all of it, and bulbs.
Yeah. Maybe we could also add to this that up here with where we have the shrub plantings, we also try to set out the shrub plants in another order. Very often when we see small plants, it's 1 by 1 meter, and that somehow also leaves us in a difficult position after establishment. And up here we have tried actually to read the plants a little more and say, this kind of shrub should be a larger distance, and this can be actually a denser distance. And it seems already now, if you walk by, that you can see the difference up there. It's actually only 2 years ago that it was planted, but it already now it's visible that this distribution of the plants actually provides some kind of feeling already at the start. So I think there is something there that could be important to elaborate actually, because we are not there yet.
So I don't think we have a photo of this, but sort of onto some of these points. This looks really nice to me, and I think this is kind of, again, a nice way of thinking. These are Amelanchias with sort of grassland meadow beneath with spring bulbs. And it's not a dense, thick planting, that these are nicely spaced. But the maintenance, I guess, is very, very simple here. Maybe very little maintenance needed. And I think this is the point. It's having simple maintenance you can do over large areas at the same time. Because the problem is, if you're not there and you don't have this ongoing involvement, how do you ensure that these things happen? And I guess it's coming down to keeping it simple. Marie's work with shrubs and perennials is very similar to work I did 15 years ago. It was kind of inspiration.
Yes, it was.
But doing just this sort of thing with roosts and salix corners, but also Amelanchia, and then seeding meadows beneath, but maintaining with coppicing.
Yes.
So that's a nice way to maintain a dynamic sense to the woody plantings, but also ensuring you don't get complete shade with the woody plantings. You cut them back or thin them out every 5 years and start the whole thing off again. But to me, I think there's so much potential for doing this sort of thing as a naturalistic way. And just talking, I like the idea that I just suggested of making plantations of young trees and shrubs and then seeding a flower mix. But starting the whole succession off at the same time. So for example, you could plant your plantations as young woody plants and have a seed mix with the annuals for year one, and perennial meadow plants, but also woodland edge species that can take the light but also would be happy with shade. So Silene dioica, that's how I say it. That we said in red campion, it kind of grows in open grassland, but it will grow in woodland, and it's a good perennial, but it will seed. And so for something like that, is that there?
Is that the one?
Yeah.
I think it is.
Yes. So these, it's there.
It's hard to see. It's there.
And I can imagine things like Primula vulgaris or Primula
That's also there.
they can all go in at the same time, and a lot of these woodland plants will feel like they're in the woodland because they'll have all the herbaceous plants over the top of them. And as the shade comes in, the more light-loving things will disappear, and then you're left over. So it's kind of an interesting idea to try and start the whole succession off at once and then almost leave it to develop by itself.
I must add to this that actually one of the principles of my 4 principles in the shrub plantings was called the Dunnett principle. But nobody knew what it was, and I had to change the name. So there you go.
Did you know what
You
it
did
was?
the credit.
Do you know the Dunnett principle?
Oh yes, you do.
Okay. Somehow I sense that we've been around the questions you posed, and we have met the headlines you made. So maybe is there any more things that you think that you'd like to discuss or the audience? And that's not the case. So I think we will just try to summarize the things. Peter showed us the situation and showed a lot of photos and plans and also told the whole timeline of the plantation, and that was of course very interesting. And after that, Nigel suggested that we could maybe be more brave and actually try to not talk about bad soil conditions and not bad growing conditions and so on, but maybe change it into the potential, which it actually also is. And I think that's a nice thought, and I think we have to elaborate or train a little on that. We are very often going into that, but it links very good to this thing about horticulture versus naturalistic plantings, that somehow it's the same knowledge we are within, but we should see it differently. So if we really want to grow plants in a horticultural tradition, then we know about nutrients and water and soil and all that stuff, and what's the opposite. So and I think that's something we are using also for the students and we combine meadows and grass, actually lawns, because it is the same discussion, but it goes in two different kind of directions. So I think that's something, and maybe also, Nigel, you also mentioned this kind of the range of naturalness, and you had other suggestions also to concentrate to zone in another way, and I think that's also interesting. And you had the discussion of scale, and also I think wanted to also stress the shrub scale in that kind of thing. And then we have been around different kind of things, and for a more general discussion, I think that you're right, Nigel, when we are focusing very much on the meadow and the open light areas, and actually we are very often another place. We are in a woodland edge, or we are in other kind of situations, and that also means that we might actually also be precautious, but always refer to the prairie, because it seems like it also locks us somehow in the discussion. We should also try to go into other things, and I think that these discussions are also underlining that we should be able to experiment and to question traditions if we can't explain them. So we actually are saying, is it really right? Is it really a rule of thumb, or is it just something that we have been doing for ages without really thinking about it? So I think that some of these general things is also generally interesting for landscape design, but it's especially also here. So I think some of these can of course also be here. And last we also discussed about maintenance and cost, and I think that it's interesting also to link it to our combination of plants, and actually also see the naturalistic plants as a kind of thing where we can somehow predict or accept the conditions for maintenance and the cost of it. So it's being there, but also being there with some kind of proudness or thing. So I think there's been a very good discussion about your project, and thank you very much for showing it. And then also we can learn again that it has also kind of general perspectives, many of the things we've done. So I think that's basically what we have been into today. But now I think it's time for you, or maybe also to see if you can point out something that you've been picking up here.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, I think today I would have liked to keep an area as free succession. How would it have looked a spot if we didn't do anything? What have we got out of it? And also we would like to make it as a study, go out and see which plants works, because we have a documentation for when we have planted. We have a lot of pictures, we have a lot of plant lists, and of course be more wise next time we do this kind of plantings. Also, we have experienced when we plant the bigger trees, we can't water enough. They die, they don't grow as they should. So I would rather have a small plant that is growing than a large one that isn't. So I took with me the planting and the flowering in the late season. I would like to work a lot more with that. And I would like to be more brave to add some of the more exotic or not natural native plants. So
mixing in the
perennials, yes,
yeah.
exactly. So why not mix the best of the perennials, best of the native plants, and the best of the non-native plants in the seedings, and then of course how to maintenance the meadows, because in these big areas it's very good, and we also actually need these light open spaces, and of course the shrubs as well. Here we are lucky, we have planted so far from each other, so we actually did your study out here more or less. It's one-to-one here. So I hope you go out and watch and learn and maybe give us some feedback. Yeah, what can I say? Actually, we also did some of the more intense and expensive plantings nearby the spaces where people could sit. So of course we did that.
No, I was just also I took note of the maybe it would have been we would have had real success with maybe the small layer of sandy soil or something on top, just to keep down the weeds that we didn't want, and just giving our plants a little head start, like you said. And then but then I was just also thinking that maybe also, but actually very much turning around the way you think about the plantings, which I think actually we're already a little bit on the way. We've been on the way since some of this was done, but also now maybe not even regarding this. Maybe now not looking at all the plants that didn't make it as necessarily a negative thing, because there are maybe this would have been completely filled up with shrubs if they had all worked. Yeah. But this way, it's sort of it actually becomes it gives maybe a more beautiful image. Actually, that something naturally dies away. So maybe keeping that. So not as the question we asked is how we could have made everything work better from the beginning is maybe actually not necessarily the way to go. So yeah, that's also a good point, I think.
So now we'll thank everybody, you and Upland Landscapes, Maria and Nigel. And it's been 2 great days. I think it's been interesting to be here. Hopefully also you and others have enjoyed the speeches, and maybe also somebody out there at the screen can follow this discussion. So thank you, and thank you very much, Nigel, for coming over. It's been fantastic, and it's given us opportunity to open some of these things. I think we should proceed doing some of this, going deep into the landscape architecture project and discuss them, because that's obviously needed in many ways. So. Thanks again for coming. There's shrubs out there. There's an exhibition. So all the best. Yeah, thank you.